Conan ó bán na tampa í Laoire. Baldwin bíon people á túil. Bhí le ciúil daoine an Santa Barbara Covers tá suaimh go sin tacht i géad a rís go lua. Tá bhí an hascail Donald tre sin seid mar a ruhan díon glasúil son bhíon Donald trí nó cara padpréile íanamh déobh chun Staire de bhí sé díon ceann faoi an dó an barracks Troid faoi lách Christóir Luasa agus faoi an únsaíar na loirithe I bun an peasant so go bhíon agad Donald. Keimineigh an áit féin is beidir féin bhar scoil agus bhí pictúr de Keimineigh in san Laoire tíreolalas bhí going it's a kid nó dar bliain scoilm agus bhí an broúla son agus deachtar gur cúscar séón ná gur sem mar an bhí glán is deise nó fearr sampla is fearr go bhí glán sa tír agus sto gur crothíoga a rith á ís an Laoire agus an crut bhí ar péradé so it is all an áite go mór mí an fór nuair bhíon dá anas a fágan de loga agus an rahanach tip na háite so well tá réganis an duine caint ólaí an áit nuair luútar Cumann Staire tip na háite seo is anam an fearr seo ágan go smúinú gach éige gach uair tá mar an ar fáid dianta leis na bíanta a déir sinnte agus tá sé luachar ó gomáid de gach éige tip na háite de bhíonn sé ar post ar televís ar radio Keimineigh ach an agus mátá dianta gur stáchan ná na hirisí na Laoire ar bhfuil sé sáite sios trí na blinta. Capan gur iad is bhí tipo néidir nócha tríúna mar sin bhís a Capiseánaí agus in bliana rinne rudach bhí ceann a fráilteige de féin agus Patrick O'Callagher tí an son thuasa scríb Patrick Caith. So tá tipo fethe Laoire in rééis sé sáite agus is mór an rud é de gachtain na háitan sa go bhfuil sé dá agus with people that hear us talk, I was going over the cyclone to Parma throwing. So, going in, could I hear us all? Yes, Sean O'Sullivan.
Right, Green Margaret Pike, stop. Louis Pike and Shannika's Patsy Kit. This is Shannika's Patsy Kit, the book we brought out at Christmas. And I'll be mentioning it in a minute. It was folklore that was collected in 1942 from Patsy Kit or Morocco above in Ghaorthaidh. But in it, he mentions Keimineigh and what happened in it, and he gives a bit of additional information. And if anybody wants it, it's available down in Frank's for a tenner, or at litriucht.com. It's in Irish, and the Irish is very easy to understand. And Patrick O'Callagher has put that together, and there's another one coming next year, and there'll be another 2 or 3 in the years after that. So, what I see, though, is fair that Bulla Bassa wrote the Patrick O'Callagher to made up with Patrick And I thought was saying there about that this was a good example of a V-clown. I know I should stick to history stuff, but I'll go back into geography. It was actually created when there was a lake before the ice, while the ice age was melting. West of the pass, there was a massive lake, and the water couldn't go out through Bantry because there was a glacier there, so the water came this way. So it's called a post-glacial overflow channel. And when the glacier melted back in Bantry, all the water went west, and this was left high and dry. So that's what created it. Was a massive river draining a lake west of the pass, and then it was left high and dry when the glacier melted. 200 years ago, last Friday, on Monday the 21st of January 1822, a battle took place in these hills, which had its roots in history's treatment, in Ireland's treatment over the previous 200 years, and was part of events which brought about changes that are still affecting us today, 200 years later. In January 1822, large groups of rebels called Rockites were gathered across North Cork, Limerick, Tipperary, and in other places in Munster, and here in the hills around Keimineigh in West Cork. They raided houses from Bandon to Bantry, stealing guns, burning crops, and naming cattle. It was part of the agrarian disturbances or violence that had started maybe 50 or 60 years before with the White Boys. So it was the same type of stuff, but it was called the Rockite movement at the time in the 1820s. After one such raid by about 500 Rockites in Bantry on January the 11th, they were pursued the next day by Lord Bantry, and his brother, Captain White, and about 50 yeomen. I'll mention yeomen quite a bit. Geimánach is in Gaeilge, there's Corrigan Geimánach Cuiste the Pass. A yeoman was a tenant farmer who also doubled as a soldier. So they were kind of a UDR of the time. They were called yeomen, and they joined with their local landlord and came and they helped to keep the peasants quiet. But the group that came here in January the 11th or January the 12th returned to Bantry again because they were afraid they hadn't enough support to take on the crowd that was around here. They organised themselves better, and then on January the 21st, a Monday, the military returned to Keimineigh. Lord Bantry in charge, his brother Captain White, the armed yeomen, and as well, they had 14 armed soldiers of the 39th Foot Regiment. The 39th Foot Regiment was a regiment of the British Army that was stationed, some of them were stationed in Bantry, and they were available because the previous couple of years had been fairly disturbed, and the 39th Foot Regiment had been fighting previously. These were experienced soldiers. They had spent time in Spain and France fighting in the Napoleonic Wars. They had spent time in America, around New York, fighting with the newly established republic in America in the 1812 war. They had been in Jamaica keeping the things under wraps there so that the slave trade could keep the economy going. And they had come to Ireland with much the same job in mind. And they were the 39th Foot Regiment. And most of the soldiers in it were Irishmen. It had spent a lot of its time since its foundation in Ireland. So John Smith, quite possibly, we thought he was probably English, but a lot of the people in it that we found out about were actually Irish, so it's quite possible John Smith was Irish. The object of the soldiers was to kill and capture as many Rockites as possible. There goes one of my holders. 2 tracks came through the pass at the time. One of them was up higher, up there above that ledge. And if anybody who parked up here can see the line, it's not very clear, but it's a ledge before we get up onto the top. And that's where there was an old path above there that was possible to take a horse and cart there with a bit of trouble. But coming through the pass here, there was a small track. The place was strewn with rocks and everything, but there was a small track for horses only coming through the pass from one end of it to the other. And Lord Bantry and his soldiers came through here first. 10 years later, this told a fella called Caesar Átha'n that when they were coming through here, they met the first casualty of Keimineigh. He was an O'Croneen, we don't know his first name. He was from Comoradh, and Patsy Kit says in Shannach's Patsy Kit that he was short-sighted, and he went, when he heard the horns blowing, calling the Rockites and calling the people that the soldiers were coming from the west, he went towards them. He put his gold Elig, his Dunfark up on his back, and he went towards the pass. And when he saw the horsemen, they thought he was his own men, and he went towards them, and Lord Bantry's men shot him straight away. So he was the first casualty. He was an O'Croneen from Comoradh. He would have been an ancestor of the Creeds in Comoradh. The next man that was killed, we also have it from Caesar Átha'n, was an O'Mahony man, an old man whose 2 sons had been transported. All his only 2 children had been transported for possession of arms. He rose up, his wife had died of a broken heart, and he rose up out of the rocks and went at the Lord Bantry's crowd. They shot him as well. When they came out the other end of the pass, they started firing. Their intention was to capture and to kill. So they started firing. They killed O'Croneen. Patsy Kit has that name as well. That's new. O'Croneen from Corrigan, high above Ballingeary near Blackabon, under Muilen. He left that day, and they never saw him again. His family. People at the battle saw him running down towards the Lee, across from Laire's house, from Burke's house, across the road and down towards the Lee, and the soldiers firing after him, and another soldier coming around behind him and catching him and dragging him away. Never heard of him again. Like that, they hunted down and killed another 3 that we know of in at the other side of the pass. There was Micheál Caith from Rainorí, and we have his descendants here today. There was Barra Laoire, we have his descendants here as well. Barra Laoire was from Ghaorthaidh, which on the other side of the pass is Douse Mountain, over on the other side of that. He was a grandfather of a James O'Leary, who was a parish priest here 100 years later. And then there was Uibh O'Leary. Uibh O'Leary was also from Rainorí, and he was up in Ghaorthaidh with Seamus Brannock, Seamus Walsh, or Seamus Brannock, I call him. Seamus Brannock was from Turlingdove, and he had been in Corrigbon before that, but he was living in Turlingdove at the time, and himself and Uibh O'Leary, having heard the horns blowing, warning that the soldiers were coming, they were heading towards the pass as well. And Uibh O'Leary was above in Ghaorthaidh, which is high up on the left when you're on the other side of the pass, and he was shot from a distance by the soldiers down in the flat. He was killed stone dead on the spot. Seamus Walsh got away and played a part then later in the next incident that happened. The soldiers left Bantry at 5 a.m. So they had spent a good piece of the day here fighting with the locals. Other people must have been killed on the day, but we never heard about them. We've heard about the local people here, but there were crowds here from as far away as east of Command towards Bandon, because reports at the time say that there was all the countryside north of Bandon and west, everybody had left to go to Inchigeela to join the Rocklights. The soldiers were at Inchigeela. There's a small hill across the road from Declan Harrington's house and Mary Harrington's house. There's a small hill there, and they were around there, and they were firing up the side of the hill at the Rocklights who were up there. They were called Rocklights because their leader was Captain Rock. I'll get to him in a minute. They were firing up at the side of Turninean and Inchimore, above where Betty and Pat Toomey's house there, and up towards the O'Sullivans and Turninean. And one of the soldiers, John Smith, being an experienced soldier, he was 32 years of age, so he had at least 10, if not 12 years of military experience behind him, decided to go around to the side to try and draw out a few of the Rocklights so that his companions could shoot him. But he went too far, and he came too close to the Rocklights, and the Rocklights saw an opportunity to inflict a bit of damage. So Seamus Brannock, he was up on the side of the hill in a field behind a rock, waiting for Smith, who he had seen coming towards him. He went out from behind the rock when Smith was close enough, and Smith took aim and fired. And Seamus Brannock had a pistol, he took aim and fired, and they both missed. So John Smith got his rifle, drove the butt into the ground, and was trying to load a bullet. There was a man in front of him, he was surrounded, there was other Rocklights around, so he was in a bit of a panic. He was putting the ball into the muzzle. It failed to be dropped on the ground, so then he went at the buttons of his tunic to try and put them into the barrel of the gun to use that as a bullet. Seamus Brannock went towards him, flipped the gun over, caught him by the muzzle and walloped him, and knocked him down the ground, breaking one of his hands. So then they started a bit of a tussle, and Seamus Brannock got away from him, and John Smith still had his rifle, went behind him, picked out his bayonet, fixed the bayonet on the rifle, and Seamus said it was either I hit him now or I'll get killed. It was one of them wasn't going to come out of this. So he hit John Smith again, and he hit him again with the butt of his pistol and broke his other arm. And then Uibh O'Leary, Mara Buí's Laoire, who wrote the poem called Keimineigh, her brother, who was from Turninean, came in behind him and picked up the gun with the bayonet. And John Smith said, "Mercy, mercy, boys, mercy." And one of the lads said, "Mercy, Gumdialert, the devil take your mercy." And that was Uibh O'Leary killed John Smith then. Seamus Brannock picked up the gun, and this was towards the end of the day, and he went with the rifle back towards the top of the pass. The pathway that I mentioned earlier was going along the top here. He went on a rock looking down on top of that pack, and he waited. He had one rifle, he had picked up the bullet that had dropped on the ground, and he had loaded his rifle, and he waited, because he knew the riders would have to go west again, and more than likely they would go that way. It would have been quicker than picking their way through the rocks here. So what happened that led to such a day of slaughter at Keimineigh, that led Seamus Moore ending up on that rock waiting until the riders went west again. His intention was to kill somebody. What led him to do this? The short-term reasons were as a result of a ruthless land agent in Newcastle West, whose son had been killed by the first Captain Rock, a man called Paddy Delan, above Newcastle West the previous June or July. Was it the fact that the previous August, massive thunderstorms over a course of 3 or 4 weeks in August and September had decimated the potato crop and the corn crop, and there was a famine coming, and it did come with possibly the death of 100,000 people in Ireland in 1822, in the same year, the following spring and summer, until the following autumn came in. There was a famine in Ireland then as well. Was it a typhoid epidemic and a famine 5 years previously or 6 years previously in 1816? Was it the economic collapse that resulted after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, which were a great economic boom for the country, but they finished in 1815? And was it the economic crisis after that caused it? Was it, bizarrely enough, a volcano in Indonesia in 1815, which dropped the temperature in the northern hemisphere by 1.5 degrees? Somebody's radio. Or was it the volcano that caused a famine in Ireland in 1816? Was it 1801 when the Act of Union took Ireland's Parliament away, even though it was a Protestant one? One of the reasons why the Rockites one of their demands was a Parliament in Ireland and our own king. They wanted to be in charge of their own stuff, and they wanted Catholic emancipation, which was votes for Catholics. Catholics weren't participating at any part of society at the time. Was it 50 years before that with the start of the White Boys and the agrarian disturbances? Was it 100 years before that when the Hollow Sword Blade Company, who had bought all of Mid-Cork from the British Crown, they bought it in 1703, and because they became involved in a financial scandal in 1723, they sold all of the parish here, as well as Mid-Cork, as well as the other estates they bought around the country. They sold them at a fraction of their cost, and resulted in this parish having not one landlord, but about 40 landlords. In 1703, like I said, the land of this parish was bought by the Hollow Sword Blade Company, which was a hedge fund. Exact same mentality. Get it cheap off the Crown, because the Crown owed you money. You got something worth more off the Crown, so they got a massive amount of land in Ireland. They then came up with a scheme where they'd sell shares for the South Sea Company, and they'd sell more shares than the South Sea Company was worth and make a killing. The only problem was the South Sea Company that they were selling shares for was supposed to make a killing to earn a lot of money, like the East Indies Company, which became very powerful in Asia. It was supposed to make a lot of money for its investors in trading with South America. It never happened because the Hollow Sword Blade Company didn't even own ships. They had nothing, they didn't have the contracts. So they conned people out of their money, and then when the whole thing went belly up, thousands of people lost money and banks went bust, and it became one of the first main financial scandals, and it was caused by the crowd who owned the parish here, the Hollow Sword Blade Company. So they ended up selling everything in 1723, exactly 99 years before Keimineigh. In 1723 they sold it. In 1727 there was another famine. And it was caused because the English were controlling the trade of Ireland to Europe. But they wanted their farmers and their tradespeople selling to Europe, so they blockaded Ireland, and Ireland had a parliament, and they restricted trade from Ireland only to Britain. So this led to economic collapse in Ireland. Bad weather led to a famine, and the people became dependent on the only crop that they could grow was potatoes. If they had had a proper functioning economy, they would have had a range of crops, but because they didn't have a properly functioning economy, they were dependent on the potato. There was another famine in 1740. This famine was worse. It was Béal and Laoire, the year of the slaughter. Out of a population of 2.5 million, 500,000 died, 20%. It was more devastating percentage-wise than the famine in 1845. In 1860, the White Boys began their agitation. It's called agrarian violence. It was agitation against rat rents, which was a landlord could evict people at the drop of a hat. There was no law governing it except ones that favoured the landlord. Tithes, which were payable by the Catholic population to the Church of Ireland, to their local Church of Ireland. So the local tithe collector went around and collected first of all from people who produced crops, and later on, around the time of Keimineigh, it was changed to just they took money from everybody. And they were fighting against tithes and the unfair the system of eviction of landlords being able to evict at will. In 1798, the United Irishmen Rebellion, in the 1810s, with the Napoleonic Wars, the economy improved, and Ireland's farmers entered a period where they were making a bit of money, and then in 1815, with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, this finished. The volcano in April 1815 reduced the temperature by 1.5 degrees and caused a famine all over Western Europe, and especially in Ireland, where the population now had grown from about 2 million in 1750. It was now heading in 1815. It was heading for 7.5 million people. The British armies no longer wanted massive amounts of food, so the price of most produce halved or went down maybe 70%. So people couldn't pay their rents. So landlords got tough and started evicting people and started the process of enclosure, where they got people to make fields. Fields weren't there before then, but they started the process of enclosure for making fields so that cattle could be raised and not have commonages where cattle just roamed around. The volcano, like I said, caused a famine in 1816. There was massive crop failures. There was no summer. It was the year without summer. There was also a typhoid epidemic, if things weren't bad enough. They had a typhoid epidemic which spread from Ireland to the rest of, which started in the southwest of Ireland and spread to the rest of Ireland and then over to Great Britain. In 1818 there was a drought, and then came the 1821, the torrential rain, and the expected famine in 1822. In Newcastle West, Alexander Hoskins was a harsh land agent for the Viscount Courtenay, and Viscount Courtenay had 34,000 acres around Newcastle West, which is fairly good land. And his land agent, Alexander Hoskins, came got the job in 1818 to put the estate on a good financial footing. The economy had collapsed. He needed the 14,000 that was owed in rent. He needed it paid. So Alexander Hoskins started a system of getting rid of the farmers who weren't paying and installing people who would pay. Patrick Deland was a local farmer. He organised a tax against, in the fashion of the White Boys, he organised a tax against the land agent, Alexander Hoskins, and against anybody who would take over a farm from which a family was evicted. The unrest spread across Limerick, North Cork, West Cork, Tipperary, Waterford, and it led to a Ghaorthaidh rebellion, where there were demands for the end of tithes, the end of rat renting and evictions, and the Béal of Catholic emancipation. The Ghaorthaidhs were called Ghaorthaidhs because this Patrick Deland started calling himself Captain Rock, because he could be Captain Rock, and the guy down here in charge of Keimineigh could be Captain Rock as well. So it kept the leaders of it anonymous, but it also made a connection between all the groups together. They had their own catechism, which was and questions and answers, which helped them. If you knew the answers to the particular questions, they knew they could identify friend from foe. They were organising it in such a fashion that it started in County Limerick, and if you were organising in one parish, you were expected to go to the next parish and get people there to organise a group as well, a group of Rockites. They went to the next parish, and it spread down all through West Cork. There was groups attacking and organising all through the autumn and before Christmas 1821 and into January 1822. Massive crowds were gathering around all that area and attacking farms and landlords' houses and killing people. There was 100 people killed throughout the whole disturbance or rebellion. A lot of the people that were caught were defended by Daniel O'Connell, and I'll get back to him in a minute. And he actually defended two of Mara Bui's sons who were arrested at Keimineigh. Large groups were in Mid-Cork in January 1822, and there were reports of large gatherings and attacks from Macroom, Mill Street to Manway. There was a report that all the men west of Bandon had gone, and they were all headed for Inchigila in the third week in January 1822, before Keimineigh. Around January 21st and in the following few days, as well as Keimineigh, soldiers were brought in, but they were failing to quell the unrest. Crowds of up to 800 or 900 people were seen every night with lit torches around the towns of Macroom. Macroom was a very loyalist town. It had a garrison of soldiers, and James Barry from Kilbarry House, which was halfway between Kilbarry National School there. It's just coincidence that's Kilbarry and James Barry. He was the toy collector, and he was the magistrate for around here as well. He was he got the soldiers in Macroom to come out to Ballingeary when Keimineigh was in full flight, and he thought better of it, and he turned tail and went back in again to Macroom with the soldiers. There was 800 or 900 people around Macroom town. The mail coach was attacked at Mill Street and destroyed. There was a pitched battle in Mill Street with some of the Rockites when they attacked British soldiers. And there was also must be focuses, I'd say. At Trelton, at Desure, there was an ambush, it's called. It was more like a slaughter. Soldiers came up, somebody let off a rifle, and they opened fire. And 6 people were killed. And then later on, with the reprisals, I get to that in a minute. The Rockites had hoped for a national rebellion, but they lacked central leadership. But all avenues in public life were closed to Catholics. Rebellion was the only thing that was open to them. As a result of all the disturbances, 200 people were transported. A couple of thousand were arrested, but 200 people were transported, and 35 were hanged. And a number of them were hanged at Trelton. There's a monument at Trelton at the co-op store at Trelton, at Desure, that there are a number of people there that were hanged. And one of the people that was hanged was another man from Comoradh called Liam O'Reen. His name is known as Edward Ring in the monument above and in Desure, but he was actually Liam O'Reen. He was William from Comoradh. Over the next 2 years, the authorities said, we'll start hanging people and we'll keep hanging them as long as there's rebellion. And after that, the activity went down and down, and it reduced and reduced over the next 2 years before the country was finally, in the authorities' words, it was in a peaceful state and things had returned to normal. Now, had they achieved anything? Well, no, they hadn't. But there is a link between Catholic emancipation and the Rockite Rebellion. Catholic emancipation was expected, which was giving votes and rights and the ability to get a job at any part of British society for Catholics. All those things were denied to Catholics before 1829. It had been promised, kind of, after the Act of Union in 1801, and eventually in 1829, Catholic emancipation came about. And the main driver of Catholic emancipation was Daniel O'Connell. And Daniel O'Connell was the great pacifist who did not like physical force violence. But he was also the man who defended the Rockites and was successful in a number of cases in getting Rockites released and proved innocent. He had to get involved in defending the Rockites, because if he was going to have any credibility with the masses, he had to be on their side. So he was the one that came and defended them. As violence was the only outlet shown to them, Catholic emancipation in British minds would have eased the Catholics' agitation, and they might have become good British citizens, which didn't work out very well. It didn't change the land holding system. They could still be evicted at will for the next 70 years. It didn't stop. This resulted in 1836, in March 1836, in this parish above in Comoradh, 11 families were kicked out in one day. 11 families in the spring of they were kicked out onto the side of the road in March 1836. It didn't make life any easier. Famines still occurred within 20 years or 25 years. You had the Great Famine in 1840. Tithes were still payable, even though they changed into a kind of a general tax later on in the 1830s. It also brought about the foundation of a constabulary force, which in 1829 became the Peelers, became a police force. But all that was in the future, and at the moment, Seamus Panach is perished above here on the side of the rock, waiting for the riders to go west again. So the riders started going west in the evening. It was getting dark. It was in January, mind the road, and he took aim at the first set of riders that he saw coming through. He fired off a shot, and a rider fell forward on his saddle, and the man beside him straightened him up, and they carried on. And the man was slumped over. Seamus Walsh doesn't know what happened to him after that point. John Smith was lying dead above on the side of the mountain. He was moved between two different bog holes over the next 3 weeks before he was finally found above in Ghaorthaidh in Ballingeary and taken down to Inchigeela, where his gravestone still is. His gravestone was erected by the Rifle Company in Mucroom, and it was knocked down a couple of times, but James Barry, the local magistrate, fined the locals every time it was knocked down to have it erected again, and after a while it was left standing, and it can still be seen down there, about 10 feet from the grave of Morbay. The other people who died on that day were taken away and buried in unmarked graves all over West Cork. We know the names, particularly of the local people, because it lived on here, but it's without doubt there were other people who were here at Keimineigh from areas east of Inchigeela and south of Inchigeela and to the west towards Ballingeary, who died that day, and they were just taken home and buried. Because if you were known to be a rebel, the authorities' response was eviction. And eviction in 1822 meant certain death, really, because no one was going to help because there wasn't a scrap of food in the country. The road through the pass, Seamus Walsh, after that, went on the run. And he was on the run for a couple of years after that. He went to England. He had friends in high places, let's say. He had been a gillie for showing when people used to go hunting above their Corriban, the wardens of Warden's Court. They got him on a ship to England through a Colonel Herd down in Kinsale, and he went to England for a while, and then he returned again, and eventually John Warden of Warden's Court was able to get him a pardon. More than likely because he wasn't the man who killed Smith. And they knew at the time that he wasn't the man who killed Smith, even though he did everything but. It was Comoradh by Laoire who had killed Smith, and it was one of the things that they were able to say in his favour. He came back to Uibh. His family were grown at this time. He was, his son was farming in Comoradh. He had moved to a farm in Comoradh, and there he ended out his days. Down through the generations, his family were involved in every subsequent fight for Irish freedom or involvement in anything to do with land agitation. His grandson, Richard Welch, was imprisoned for what's called the moonlighting case, where the Walsh family were going to be evicted, and they attacked a neighbouring family who wanted to take over the land. And this was the system that the rent had been raised. He was given every chance to pay it, sort of thing. And they were evicting the Walshes in 1893. And eventually there was a court case about the attack, and Richard Walsh spent a period of time in prison. And they stayed on their farm. And the next generation then, Richard's sister was married in Comoradh, and her two sons, Tadhg Toomey and Liam Toomey, were involved in the War of Independence, and they went out in 1916 to go to Bantry, and they were involved in that. They were Seamus Walsh's great-grandchildren. The poet Marabine Laoire, who lives in the house, the first house on the right when you go down through the pass, is Burke's house. Marabine was married to James Burke, and Marabine was alive at the time, and she witnessed all the events. She would have seen all the things that were happening down there, and she wrote Keimineigh afterwards, which expressed the anger and frustration, and anger was the main emotion in it, the anger of the time. And her two sons were arrested, and they were tried, and they were acquitted, mostly through the help of Daniel O'Connell, who was defending them and others in the court cases that followed Keimineigh. James Barry from Kilbarry, his house was burnt down the following month in Kilbarry, and smart man that he was, he got his tenants together, and he got all the locals together, and he made them knock down Carriganeira Castle, one of the O'Leary castles, which was near his house in Kilbarry, and built him another house. And that house still stands today. He's buried in Inchigeelagh, as in the old graveyard in Inchigeelagh. The military, one of the things that results of Keimineigh and the Rockite Rebellion was that the British realised they weren't getting around the countryside half fast enough to quieten the peasants. So a lot of money was invested in building roads, not for the betterment of the economy of the locality so that people would have more food. It was to get the soldiers in quicker. And one of the roads that was built is the one there. That road was built in 1830s with money that was provided to facilitate the movement of military. That then had an economic impact, of course, and it led to it was continued on along the lake between Ballingeary and Inchigeelagh. Eventually, and it led to the development of Ballingeary village, where Ballingeary village is. It was just slightly above it at the time. James Barry actually organised that, and interestingly enough, one of the I think it was Micheál Caith from Rainory, who died at the battle. His brother was one of the contractors who got a job on this working and helping to build the road through it 10 years later. There are two monuments here. There's a monument down at the bottom to Marabine Laoire. Marabine Laoire wrote loads of poems. I won't go into her life story at the moment. It's very, very interesting, and it encapsulates everything about Irish history. Her family suffered evictions on numerous occasions, and she lived everything that we've been talking about before this. The other monument is up at the top of the pass. Cumann will be having their commemoration up there after this, and anybody who wants to go up there is welcome to go up there. You might be better off walking, maybe. It's hard to park up there. But if anybody's looking for more information about this, there's a great book by James Donnelly, a professor of history in Wisconsin, who has written extensively on especially on this era of the Rockite Rebellion. It's a book called Captain Rock, the Irish Agrarian Rebellion of 1822 to 1824. And it's as exciting as it sounds. It has all the information, and that whole history has been forgotten. And one of the reasons I think it's been forgotten is because it wasn't a rebellion that was led by academics or professionals or dreamers and poets. It was a rebellion that was led from the bottom up. And it didn't fit in with Daniel O'Connell's idea of that would help Catholic emancipation. It was born out of anger more than anything. But a lot of the reason why it was the largest violent event in Irish history from 1600 up as far in this part of the country, the 1798 rebellion wasn't near it at all. But down here it was the most violent agrarian rebellion before the famine. So if you want to read more, James Donnelly's book, Captain Rock and the Irish Agrarian Rebellion, is a good one. And we'll have to plug this one again. It's down in Frank's, a tenner, cheap at the price. And you can go to literature.com. Literature.com as well has it and a lot of our other publications. Anyway, I hope I filled you in on some aspects of it. You can go and find out more yourselves now. I'd like to welcome the Collinses, the Walshes from Turringdove, the Collinses and the Ryans. Peggy Ryan and Sheila Collins are here. Their grandfather was Richard Walsh, who was a grandson of Seamus Walsh. I won't go into all the greats. And we also have Micheál O'Cahisigh's descendants here from Granary, the Toobies there. And we have down in Chile yesterday, Barrow there's descendants were there. But anybody else here who's connected to Uibh, but it's fair to say that the rebellion at the time was so widespread that everybody had skin in the game, for lack of a better phrase, that everybody here now had some connection to it, on one side or the other. But it was a very, very widespread rebellion. It involved a massive amount of people. It involved a massive amount of anger, and it didn't lead to any immediate results, but it did lead to eventually to Cork playing a big part in the War of Independence 100 years later, because they remembered the 100 years before that, and that people were willing to head away once they heard the horns blowing, that something was happening. They headed off with their Dunfork on their shoulder to face the battle, because serious business was intended, and they knew it. So, Ramila Mahadov Blair.
Just good evening, Shawnee. Thanks very much. So the level of detail is incredible, isn't it? I must say, we're so lucky there, Shawnee, such research put into it. And so well delivered also. I see with Jim Laoire and son, brother, with Shawnee. Jim Laoire wants to make a presentation to Shawnee.
This is a presentation to me, so I want it out in front of everybody. Come on over here.
Dermot O'Leary from the O'Leary Clan Committee. We have an O'Leary Clan commemorative coin, and I'd like to, on behalf of the clan, present it to Sean.
Initially, Átha'n on all in Shin Keimineigh a Conda, August Boxady Bannon saw she should Pashi Átha'n Ashton Gal when on a road the Caith book the yoga, Snahata, August Ashton a Bannon store, Banning course of child. The road Irish Banning home.
In Ivlera Shavim Shah Maratanan Pisania Kanshir Hal Sol Matnu Shalom Pei Eden of Masmuinta Egest of the Wheel Labingan. No Pullen caught ik talk the near is glorn the knack ik talk leshins left women at him the shrin sleeve snarving lamang lord on the durgan adver mar hug Ghaorthaidh de conniv ni agus commemoration the sarir Agather gan tror Near on Forbartha Poiste na truv na dear hud na gargwil the vika na milta all the gone if you can tear on the Galadder nar dimple Ilach agus Selina's squeal and the throat On lugar la again Shed thort got flogger valish trill Glushi gamar pan kadar ears Temish na chord On the durn the starir Gwima sar clonagwil Scum on the durn the panig Left panig gershol Near by the gwinga Danig and lag ladder Nar dimple Gur scap there arnlin ergak Wheeling Fhia Bien barak na vambalka Barn darkest feature Hedges agus wheatigis na mila ello Arena garper lagagith Gan clo gan bas Gan ra gan shin sitting to mara Imasn the bean Gan fwisha good o Kitten malamur leisa Nar yedamar asador Ag vedin the bring dead Sa ancient er so